The library closed at 6 every evening, but Elena Morrison stayed until 7, sometimes 8, methodically reshelving books in the dim amber light that filtered through tall windows. The building sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, in the small town of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, its red brick walls holding decades of whispered stories and forgotten dreams. Elena preferred the silence that came after the last patron left, when dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, and the only sounds were the gentle thud of books finding their proper places and the distant hum of the old heating system. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She moved between the stacks with practiced efficiency, her fingers trailing along book spines as she worked. Fiction went to the left wing, nonfiction to the right, children's books downstairs in the basement reading room with its cheerful yellow walls and tiny chairs. Elena knew every section, every shelf, every corner of this place that had become her sanctuary over the past 3 years. The head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman in her 70s with silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain, had offered Elena the job when others in town had turned her away with uncomfortable glances and mumbled excuses. The scars began at Elena's left temple and traced an irregular path down the side of her face, across her jaw, and disappeared beneath the collar of whatever modest blouse she wore that day. The skin was raised in some places, puckered in others. A roadmap of trauma written in flesh that told the story of a house fire 5 years ago. She had been 22 then, fresh out of college with a degree in education and dreams of teaching children to love reading the way she did. The fire had taken more than just her smooth skin. It had taken her confidence, her teaching career. Before it started, and her place in a community that struggled to look past physical imperfection. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the morning newspaper and judgment came as naturally as breathing. Population 8,847, according to the welcome sign at the town limits, though Elena suspected that number hadn't been updated in years. Main Street stretched 6 blocks with a hardware store, 2 cafes, a pharmacy, a small grocery market, and the inevitable dollar store that had driven out 3 family businesses in the past decade. The people were decent enough, hardworking. Folks who attended the Methodist church on Sundays and gathered at high school football games on Friday nights, but they weren't comfortable with reminders of life's fragility. Elena had learned to navigate their discomfort with careful precision. She wore her brown hair long and parted on the right side, letting it fall like a curtain across the worst of the scarring. She chose clothing with high necklines and long sleeves even in summer. She shopped at the grocery store early in the morning when fewer people were around, kept her head down at the post office, and avoided the town's social gatherings entirely. The annual Harvest Festival, the 4th of July parade, the Christmas tree lighting ceremony. She watched them all from her apartment window above the old bakery on Elm Street, close enough to hear the laughter and music, but far enough away to remain invisible. Her apartment was small but comfortable, with hardwood floors that creaked in familiar places and windows that faced east toward the sunrise. She had filled it with books, hundreds of them stacked on shelves she'd built herself and piled on tables and windowsills. Romance novels and poetry collections, biographies of brave women, and scientific journals about medical advances. Reading had always been her escape, even before the fire, but now it was her lifeline to worlds where appearance mattered less than. Courage, where heroines overcame obstacles through wit and determination rather than conventional beauty. The isolation wasn't complete, of course. Mrs. Patterson checked on her regularly, bringing homemade soup and gentle conversation about library matters. Dr. Sarah Chun, the town's only physician, had become something close to a friend during the long months of skin grafts and healing. Elena's mother called twice a week from Phoenix, where she'd moved after Elena's father passed away, Their conversations careful dances around the subject of when Elena might visit or whether she'd considered moving somewhere larger, somewhere more anonymous. But Elena had grown attached to Cedar Falls despite its flaws. She knew which streets flooded during spring rains and which shortcuts avoided the morning school traffic. She could predict Mrs. Henderson's weekly visit to check out romance novels and Mr. Rodriguez's research habits for his local history project. The town library had become her domain, a place where knowledge mattered more than appearance and where she could help others find what they needed without judgment or pity. The children were different, of course. They stared openly at first, the way children do, but their curiosity was clean and honest. 8-year-old Tommy Walsh asked her directly if it hurt, while his sister Katie wanted to know if the scars had a story like the ones in books. Elena found herself telling them about the night of the fire, how she'd helped her elderly neighbor Mrs. Foster escape from the burning duplex they'd shared, how the scars were proof she'd been brave when it mattered most. The children accepted this explanation with the matter-of-fact wisdom that adults seemed to lose somewhere along the way. It was the adults who struggled. Elena could see it in their sideways glances when she walked past the cafe windows, in the way conversations died when she entered the pharmacy, in the carefully neutral expressions of parents dropping their children off for story time. They weren't cruel, exactly, but they were uncomfortable, and their discomfort had a way of making Elena feel like an intruder in her own community. She had tried dating exactly once since moving to Cedar Falls. Mark Stevens, a substitute teacher, who'd seemed genuinely interested during their brief conversations at the library. He'd asked her to dinner at Romano's, the nicer of the town's 2 restaurants, and Elena had spent an hour getting ready, choosing her outfit with care and practicing conversations in the mirror. The evening had started well enough. Mark was intelligent and funny, asking thoughtful questions about her work and sharing stories about his own experiences in education. But as the night progressed, Elena noticed how his eyes kept drifting to the left side of her face, how his smile became more forced, how he found reasons to look away when she turned toward him. He didn't ask for a second date, and 2 weeks later she'd heard through Mrs. Patterson that he was seeing Jennifer Walsh, the blonde kindergarten teacher with perfect skin and an easy laugh. Elena had felt the familiar sting of rejection, but underneath it was something worse: relief that she wouldn't have to pretend anymore, that someone could see past her scars to find her beautiful. The town's social hierarchy was unspoken, but clearly defined. At the top were the business owners and professionals, Dr. Chun, the bank president, the high school principal. Below them came the shop owners, the teachers, the postal workers, all the people who kept the community functioning. Elena existed somewhere in the margins, useful but not quite included, valued for her skills but not invited into the inner circles where relationships formed and real connections were made. Evenings were the hardest time. After the library closed, and she'd walk the 3 blocks home, climbing the narrow stairs to her apartment above what used to be Peterson's Bakery, the silence could feel overwhelming. She'd cook simple meals for one, watch old movies on her laptop, read until her eyes grew heavy. Sometimes she'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the town settle into the night porch lights coming on, families gathering for dinner, teenagers walking in groups toward the ice cream stand on Main Street. She developed routines that made the solitude bearable. Monday evenings were for meal planning and grocery shopping at the IGA when it was nearly empty. Tuesdays she organized her bookshelves, creating new displays for the library and sorting through donations that people dropped off in cardboard boxes. Wednesdays she wrote in the journal she'd kept since college, documenting the small moments that made up her days. Thursdays were for online research, staying current with library science trends and reading about new programs other small libraries had implemented successfully. Friday nights were for indulgence takeout from Chun's Garden, the Chinese restaurant run by Dr. Chun's aunt, and whatever romance novel she'd been saving for the week's end. She'd learned to find satisfaction in these small pleasures, to build a life that didn't depend on external validation or social acceptance. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 22, but it was peaceful in its own way, predictable, and safe. The library itself had become an extension of her personality. She'd created reading nooks with comfortable chairs and good lighting, organized book clubs for different age groups, and established a quiet study area where high school students could work on homework without distraction. The children's section bore her special attention, colorful displays that changed monthly, storytelling sessions twice a week, and a summer reading program that had grown more popular each year. Parents began to trust her with their children, despite their own discomfort. Elena had a gift for connecting with young readers, for finding exactly the right book to capture a reluctant student's imagination or challenge an advanced reader without overwhelming them. She remembered every child's preferences, could recommend series that would keep them engaged for months, and never made them feel foolish for their questions or reading choices. The work gave her purpose even when the isolation felt too heavy to bear. Every book she helped someone find, every research question she answered, every child who discovered a new favorite author felt like a small victory against the prejudice that tried to define her worth by her appearance. The library was neutral, territory where her knowledge and helpfulness mattered more than the scars that marked her face. But late at night, when the routines ended and the distractions faded, Elena sometimes caught herself in mirrors and felt the old familiar ache. Not for her appearance exactly, she'd made peace with that long ago, but for the life that might have been. The teaching career, the easy friendships, the possibility of love with someone who saw her scars as just one part of a larger story, rather than the defining chapter. Those were the nights when she'd pull out the photo albums from before the fire, when her face was unmarked and the future seemed limitless. She'd look at pictures of herself with college friends, laughing at parties and posing for graduation photos, and feel like she was looking at a stranger. That girl had believed the world was fair, that good intentions and hard work would be enough, that beauty was nice but not necessary for happiness. The girl in those photos couldn't have imagined the careful choreography that now defined Elena's days, the strategic hair arrangements, the thoughtful clothing choices, the routes through town that minimized unwanted encounters. She couldn't have pictured a life lived in libraries and apartments, meaningful but small, safe but somehow incomplete. Winter in Cedar Falls was especially quiet, when snow muffled the sounds of daily life and people hurried between warm buildings without stopping to chat. Elena found a different kind of peace in those months, when the cold gave everyone an excuse to stay inside and her solitude felt less unusual. She'd arrive at the library early on snowy mornings, starting the coffee and turning on all the lights, before the first patrons arrived seeking warmth and Wi-Fi and temporary escape from the season's isolation. It was during one of those quiet winter mornings, with snow falling steadily outside the tall windows and the heating system working overtime to keep the old building warm, that Elena's carefully constructed solitude would be interrupted by a stranger whose own scars told stories of survival. That made hers seem small by comparison. The morning David Blackwood first walked into the Cedar Falls Public Library, the snow was coming down in thick, lazy flakes that stuck to the windows and muffled the usual sounds of Main Street awakening. Elena had arrived early, as was her habit, unlocking the heavy oak doors at 7:30 instead of the official 8 o'clock opening time. She liked these extra 30 minutes when the building belonged entirely to her, when she could move through the stacks checking for overnight damages or displaced books, when the morning light slanted through the tall windows just right to illuminate the reading areas she'd arranged with such care. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was wheeling a cart of returned books from the drop slot when she heard the front door open with its familiar squeak of hinges that needed oil. Elena glanced up, expecting to see Mrs. Patterson arriving early, or perhaps Tommy, Walsh's mother, dropping off overdue picture books before school. Instead, she saw a man she didn't recognize, and in a town the size of Cedar Falls, strangers were notable events. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out a dark green military surplus jacket. His hair was steel gray, cut short but not severely so, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors. But it was his left sleeve that caught Elena's attention. It hung empty, pinned up neatly at the shoulder. He moved with the careful balance of someone who'd learned to navigate the world with one arm, and there was something in his posture that spoke of both strength and resignation. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of a southern accent, maybe Tennessee or Kentucky. "Library open yet?" Elena realized she'd been staring and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes, of course." "Come in. The heat's just getting going, so it's still a bit cold." He stepped inside, snow melting off his boots onto the rubber mat she'd placed by the entrance. "Appreciate it. Name's David Blackwood. Just moved to town yesterday, staying at the boarding house on Pine Street until I can find something more permanent." "Elena Morrison. I'm the assistant librarian." She gestured toward the circulation desk. "What can I help you find?" David surveyed the main room with the careful attention of someone accustomed to assessing new environments. His eyes took in the reading areas, the computer stations, the children's section visible through the archway, the tall shelves that divided fiction from nonfiction. "Actually looking for work," he said. "Figured the library might know what's available around town. Job boards, local paper, that sort of thing." Elena felt an unexpected flutter of sympathy. She knew what it was like to search for employment in Cedar Falls, to face the subtle rejections and careful explanations about why positions weren't quite right. For someone with a visible disability in a small town, the challenges would be even greater. "The Cedar Falls Gazette is on the periodical rack over there," she said, pointing toward the far wall. "They publish job listings every Wednesday. Mrs. Henderson at the unemployment office usually posts notices on our community bulletin board too. And there's a computer you can use for online searches if you need it. Much obliged." David moved toward the newspaper rack with the slightly uneven gait of someone whose balance had been permanently altered. Elena tried not to watch, but something about his presence commanded attention. There was a quietness to him that felt different from her own carefully cultivated invisibility. His was the stillness of someone who'd learned to observe before acting, who developed patience through necessity rather than choice. Elena returned to her book cart, but found herself aware of his movements as he settled into one of the reading chairs near the windows. He'd positioned himself where he could see both the entrance and the rest of the room, another habit that spoke of military training or hard-earned caution. The morning light revealed more details: the slight tremor in his remaining hand that suggested old injuries, the careful way he held his head that made Elena wonder if hearing damage accompanied whatever had cost him his arm. Other patrons began arriving as the official opening hour approached. Mrs. Patterson bustled in with her usual cheerful energy, hanging her coat on the hook behind the circulation desk and immediately beginning her review of the overnight book returns. Mr. Rodriguez appeared with his notebook and pencil, heading straight for the local history section where he'd been researching his family's connection to the town's founding families. 3 high school students claimed the study tables near the back, spreading out textbooks and papers with the dramatic sighs of teenagers facing morning assignments. Through it all, David remained focused on the newspaper, occasionally making notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. Elena found herself stealing glances in his direction, curious about what had brought him to Cedar Falls. The town wasn't exactly a destination for newcomers. People left Cedar Falls for opportunities in Minneapolis or St. Paul, or they stayed because they'd been born here and never found sufficient reason to leave. Strangers usually arrived by accident or necessity, rarely by choice. Around 10 o'clock, the morning rush subsided into the library's typical weekday quiet. Mrs. Patterson was processing new acquisitions in her office. The high school students had left for their next classes, and Mr. Rodriguez was deep in microfilm research. Elena was updating the children's display when David approached the circulation desk. "Wondering if you might have books about starting over," he said. "Self-help, career guidance, that kind of thing." The request was simple enough, but something in his tone suggested layers beneath the surface. Elena set down the picture book she'd been arranging. "Are you looking for something specific? Career change resources or more general life transition? Materials?" David considered this for a moment. "Both, I suppose. I'm 43 years old, got medically discharged from the Army 2 years ago. Spent most of my adult life in uniform, and I'm still figuring out what comes next." Elena felt a recognition stir in her chest. The understanding that comes from meeting another person whose life had been divided into before and after. "The self-help section is in the 100s, she said, moving out from behind the desk. "But we might find some useful things in other areas too." "What kind of work are you considering?" "Honestly, anything that doesn't require 2 arms and doesn't involve sitting behind a desk all day." His smile was wry, but not bitter. "I was a combat engineer for 21 years. Good with my hands, problem solving, working with tools. But the civilian job market's been challenging." Elena led him toward the non-fiction stacks, her mind already cataloging possibilities. "Have you considered trade work? Construction, electrical, plumbing? Cedar Falls has several contractors who might value military experience. Thought about it. Problem is, most trades assume you've got full use of both arms. I can do more than people think, but convincing them of that is the hard part." They'd reached the self-help section, and Elena began pulling books from the shelves: career transition guides, entrepreneurship resources, disability rights manuals. But as she worked, her attention was caught by David's matter-of-fact tone. When discussing his limitations, there was no self-pity in his voice, no anger at circumstances beyond his control. Just practical assessment of reality and determination to move forward. "Here's something that might help," Elena said, handing him a book about veterans transitioning to civilian careers. "And this one has a good section on advocating for yourself with potential employers." David accepted the books, managing to hold them against his chest with his remaining arm while maintaining his balance. The simple logistics of carrying multiple items would have been effortless before his injury, Elena realized, but now required planning and adaptation. "You know," she said, the words emerging before she'd fully considered them, "there's a man in town who might be worth talking to. Jake Murphy runs Murphy's Construction. He's always looking for skilled workers, and he's more open-minded than some. Appreciate the tip." David shifted the books to a more secure position. "You seem to know the town pretty well. I've been here 3 years. It's the kind of place where you either fit in or you don't, but there are good people if you know where to look." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she'd intended, because David studied her face with increased attention. Elena felt the familiar urge to turn away, to angle her head so the worst of the scarring was hidden, but something about his steady gaze made her resist the impulse. "Army teach you that?" she asked. "Reading people?" "Among other things." His eyes didn't waver from hers. "Also taught me that scars usually have stories worth hearing." Elena's breath caught. Most people pretended not to notice her disfigurement, their gazes sliding away with practiced politeness. Others stared with uncomfortable fascination. But David's acknowledgement was direct without being intrusive, matter-of-fact without being dismissive. "Not much of a story," she said finally. "House fire 5 years ago. Wrong place, wrong time. Saving someone else?" The question surprised her. "How did you know that?" Because people who get hurt running away from fires don't carry themselves the way you do. And because the worst scars usually come from the best choices. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. My neighbor was elderly, couldn't get out on her own. The fire department said another few minutes and we both would have died. David nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. And now you help people find what they need here instead of in burning buildings. Books are safer than house fires. But not less important. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Walsh children for afternoon story time. 8-year-old Tommy bounded through the door, followed by his more cautious sister Katie, both of them calling greetings to Elena with the easy familiarity of regular visitors. "Miss Elena," Tommy announced. "Mom said we could stay extra long today because she's getting her hair done." "Wonderful," Elena replied, automatically shifting into her children's librarian mode. "I've got some new picture books about winter animals, and Katie, I found that series about the girl detective you wanted to read." The children noticed David. Immediately, their attention drawn by his missing arm with the open curiosity that adults had trained themselves to suppress. Tommy stared openly while Katie hung back behind her brother, uncertain but intrigued. "That's a pretty cool jacket." Tommy said to David, "Are you a soldier?" "Was a soldier," David replied easily. "Now I'm just a guy looking for work." "What happened to your arm?" The question that adults danced around, Tommy asked with straightforward interest. "Tommy," Elena began, but David held up his hand. "It's fine. I was in Afghanistan, and there was an explosion. Sometimes when soldiers get hurt, the doctors have to remove parts that can't be fixed." Katie stepped forward slightly. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes. But not as much as you might think. I've gotten pretty good at doing things with one arm." "Can you still drive?" Tommy wanted to know. "Sure can. And I can tie my shoes, cook dinner, even play catch if someone's patient enough to throw the ball where I can catch it." Elena watched this exchange with growing fascination. David answered the children's questions with the same matter-of-fact honesty he'd shown when discussing his job search. No deflection, no discomfort, just straightforward information delivered in a way that satisfied their curiosity without making his injury seem frightening or shameful. "Miss Elena has scars too," Katie announced with the blunt honesty of childhood. "From when she saved Mrs. Foster from the fire." "I heard about that," David said, including Katie in the conversation with the same serious attention he'd given her brother. "That was pretty brave." "She's the bravest person in town," Tommy declared with fierce loyalty. "Anyone who says something different is stupid." Elena felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She'd grown accustomed to the children's easy acceptance of her appearance, but hearing Tommy defend her so passionately was something new. "Well then," David said, "sounds like I came to the right place for help finding my way around town." The afternoon proceeded with Elena conducting story time while David read through the career book she'd gathered for him. She found herself aware of his presence in a way that felt both comfortable and unsettling. He didn't stare at her during the children's program, but she could sense his attention, could feel him observing how she interacted with Tommy and Katie. And the two other children who arrived partway through the session. When story time ended and the children had been collected by their parents, David approached the desk again. "Mind if I ask you something?" Elena felt her defenses rise slightly. "What's that?" "Those kids think the world of you. But I'm guessing not everyone in town sees past the surface the way they do." It wasn't really a question, and Elena found herself nodding before she could consider whether she wanted to have this conversation with a stranger. Small towns can be challenging for people who look different. People who've survived something, you mean? The distinction hit her like a gentle correction. She'd been thinking of herself as damaged, disfigured, different in ways that made others uncomfortable. But David framed it as survival. as evidence of having endured something difficult and emerged intact. I suppose that's one way to look at it. It's the right way to look at it. David gathered his books, preparing to leave. In the army, we learn to read terrain, what's dangerous, what's safe, what's worth fighting for. Towns have terrain too. And from what I can see, this place is lucky to have you, whether they're smart enough to know it or not. He headed toward the door, then paused. That contractor you mentioned, Murphy's Construction. Where would I find him? Workshop on Industrial Road, about a mile past the grain elevator. Tell him Elena Morrison suggested you talk to him. He'll know what that means. David nodded and stepped out into the afternoon snow, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the strange sense that something important had just shifted in the careful balance of her world. The following Tuesday morning brought with it an unexpected warmth for February in Minnesota, the kind of false spring that made people walk a little slower and smile at strangers on the sidewalk. Elena arrived at the library to find David Blackwood waiting on the front steps, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand and what looked like a brown paper bag beside him on the concrete. "Morning," he said as she approached with her keys. "Brought breakfast. Figured you might not have had time to eat before opening up." Elena paused, her hand halfway to the lock. In 3 years of working at the library, no one had ever brought her breakfast. The gesture was small but somehow significant, crossing an invisible line from polite acquaintance to something that might become friendship. "That's very thoughtful. But you didn't need to. Bakery's right below your apartment," David said with a slight smile. "Saw the light on in your window at 6 this morning when I was walking past. Plus, I wanted to thank you for the introduction to Jake Murphy." Elena unlocked the door and held it open for him. "How did that go?" "Better than expected. Starts me on Thursday doing finish carpentry work. Says if I can handle trim and detail work with one arm, he'll find plenty for me to do." David followed her inside, setting his coffee on the circulation desk. Man's got a good eye for what people can do instead of what they can't. Elena felt a surge of genuine pleasure at this news. She'd recommended David to Jake Murphy partly because she believed in his capabilities, but also because Jake was one of the few people in town who judged others by their actions rather than their appearance. "He's a decent man. His son was born with cerebral palsy, so Jake learned early not to underestimate people with disabilities." "Makes sense." David opened a paper bag, revealing 2 Danish pastries and what smelled like cinnamon coffee cake. "Hope you don't mind the selection. Peterson's granddaughter runs the place now, and she insisted I try the family recipe." Elena accepted a piece of coffee cake, surprised by how natural this felt sharing breakfast with someone in the quiet sanctuary of her library before the day officially began. The cake was still warm, sweet with cinnamon and brown sugar, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time food tasted this good. "Sarah Peterson makes excellent coffee cake," Elena said. "Her grandmother taught her the recipe before she passed away last year." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the town wake up through the tall windows. Elena found herself studying David's face in profile as he gazed out at Main Street. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into the desert sun, and there was a small scar along his jaw that she hadn't noticed before. His injuries weren't limited to his missing arm. She realized they were just the most visible evidence of whatever had happened to him overseas. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said, surprising herself with the question. "Shoot, do you ever miss it, being a soldier?" David considered this while finishing his Danish. "I miss the purpose," he said finally, knowing exactly what needed to be done and why. The brotherhood, too, having people you'd trust with your life standing next to you every day. But I don't miss the fear or the constant awareness that everything could go wrong in an instant. Is that why you came here? To Cedar Falls? Partly. My sister lives in Duluth, and she's been after me to move closer to family. But mostly I needed somewhere quiet to figure out who I am when I'm not wearing a uniform. He turned to look at her directly. What about you? You grew up here? Madison originally. Came here right after college to teach at the elementary school. But ... Elena gestured vaguely toward her face. After the fire, they decided I might be too distracting for young children. The library job opened up 6 months later. There. Loss, David said with quiet conviction. Watched you with those kids yesterday. You're a natural teacher. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. I love working with children. They see the world differently than adults. They see honestly. Adults train themselves to look away from things that make them uncomfortable. It was such an accurate description of her daily experience that Elena almost laughed. You figured out small-town dynamics pretty quickly. Not just small towns. People everywhere struggle with difference. The military's not immune to it. Either I got plenty of stares and whispered conversations after I lost the arm. Difference is, in the army they still had to work with me. Here, people can just avoid you if they want to. Elena nodded, recognizing the truth in his observation. Sometimes I think about moving somewhere bigger, where I could be anonymous. But you don't. No, I don't. She couldn't fully explain why she stayed in Cedar Falls despite the social isolation. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the hope that things might gradually improve. I suppose I don't want to let them drive me away. Good for you. David's approval was immediate and sincere. Running away doesn't solve anything, just changes the scenery. Mrs. Patterson arrived then, bustling through the door with her usual cheerful energy and stopping short when she saw David sitting at the circulation desk, sharing breakfast with Elena. Oh, I didn't realize we had early visitors. Elena performed introductions, watching Mrs. Patterson's face carefully for signs of the disapproval that sometimes surfaced when people thought Elena was getting too friendly with library patrons. Instead, the older woman's expression brightened. With genuine interest, David Blackwood. Jake Murphy called me last night. My husband and Jake play poker together. He was very impressed with your work experience. Welcome to Cedar Falls. Thank you, ma'am. Elena here made the introduction. Seems like she knows everyone worth knowing in this town. Mrs. Patterson beamed. Elena's been a godsend to this library. We were struggling before she arrived. Previous assistant had no imagination, no connection with the community. Elena transformed this place into something special. Elena felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Mrs. Patterson, you're exaggerating. Not at all. The children's programs alone have brought families back to the library who hadn't visited in years. And the adult book clubs, the reading challenges, the partnerships with the schools, all Elena's ideas. David looked around the library with new appreciation. Sounds like you've built something important here. We all have, Elena said, uncomfortable with being singled out for praise, but touched by Mrs. Patterson's loyalty. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm, but Elena found herself more aware than usual of how she moved through her work. When David positioned himself at one of the reading tables with a book about small business development, she caught herself straightening her shoulders and speaking more confidently with patrons. Something about having him in her space made her feel more substantial somehow, less invisible. Around 11 o'clock, the library's quiet was disrupted by the arrival of Margaret Thornton and her daughter Jessica. Margaret served on the town council and had opinions about everything from snow removal to appropriate behavior for public employees. Jessica was 18, home from her first semester at college, and possessed the casual cruelty that sometimes came with youth and privilege. Elena, Margaret said briskly, approaching the circulation desk, I need to discuss the upcoming town budget meeting. There are concerns about library spending. Elena's stomach tightened. Budget meetings always brought anxiety, the constant need to justify the library's existence to people who saw books as an unnecessary expense. Of course, what specific concerns? Well, frankly, some council members question whether we need a full-time assistant librarian. Mrs. Patterson is perfectly capable of running things on her own, and the cost savings could be redirected to road maintenance. Jessica wandered toward the periodical section, her attention caught by David sitting at the reading table. Elena noticed the girl's double take, saw her eyes linger on his missing sleeve with the fascination of someone encountering disability as entertainment rather than reality. The library serves over 800 active patrons, Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady. We've increased circulation by 30% since I started working here, and our programs serve nearly 200 children annually. Yes. Well, numbers can be manipulated to support any position. Margaret's tone suggested the matter was already decided. We'll be voting next Tuesday. I thought you should know. Elena felt the familiar crushing sensation of being judged dispensable, of having her worth reduced to budget line items and political convenience. She managed to nod and thank Margaret for the advance notice, but inside she was calculating how long her savings would last and whether she could find another job before they ran out. After Margaret left, dragging Jessica away from her obvious. Staring at David, Elena found herself struggling to concentrate on her work. The casual dismissal of her contributions, the implication that she was expendable, brought back all the old feelings of being unwanted and unwelcome. David appeared at the circulation desk during the lunch lull. Couldn't help overhearing that conversation. Sounds like you might be dealing with some workplace politics. Elena attempted a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. Small-town budget constraints. Nothing I haven't dealt with before. But it bothers you. It wasn't a question, and Elena found herself nodding despite her intention to downplay the situation. I love this job. I love this place. The idea of losing it because someone thinks I'm unnecessary. She trailed off, not trusting her voice. To remain steady. You're not unnecessary. David's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making definitive statements. This place is different because you're here. Anyone with eyes can see that. Margaret Thornton doesn't seem to think so. Margaret Thornton strikes me as someone who's never built anything herself, just criticized what other people have created. Elena managed a genuine smile at this assessment. That's probably fair. Tell me about the budget meeting. When is it? How does it work? Next Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock at the town hall. Open to the public, but usually only a few people. Attend unless there's something controversial on the agenda. David nodded thoughtfully. Might be worth attending. Sometimes having community members speak up can influence these decisions. Elena felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. You do that? You barely know me, and you're new in town. I know enough. And sometimes it takes an outsider to point out what locals take for granted. The afternoon brought a steady stream of patrons' mothers with toddlers for story time, high school students researching projects, elderly residents seeking large print mysteries. Elena moved through her duties with renewed energy, bolstered by David's quiet support and the possibility that someone might speak up for her at the budget meeting. During story time, she noticed David listening from his table as she read The Velveteen Rabbit to a group of 6 children. When she reached the passage about toys becoming real through being loved despite their worn appearance, she caught his eye and saw understanding there, recognition of the story's deeper meaning about value and worth. After the children left, Elena began her end-of-day tasks while David finished reading his business development book. The library felt different with him in it, less like a refuge from the world and more like a place where meaningful work happened. His presence validated what she'd built here in a way that budget reports and circulation statistics never could. Elena, David said as she began turning off the computers. That comment the teenager made earlier about your scars being gross, did you hear that? Elena's hand stilled on the keyboard. She had heard Jessica's whispered comment to her mother, but had pretended not to notice. "I've heard worse. I'm sure you have. But that doesn't make it acceptable. It's just ignorance. She's young. Youth doesn't excuse cruelty." David closed his book and stood up. "In Afghanistan, I knew soldiers who'd been burned by IEDs, others who'd lost limbs or eyes or parts of their faces. Know what we called them? Warriors, survivors, heroes who'd paid a price for something bigger than themselves." Elena felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "This isn't a war zone, David, isn't it?" He moved closer to the circulation desk. "Every day you come here and face people who think your worth is determined by how you look. Every day you choose to keep building something beautiful despite their judgment. If that's not fighting a battle, I don't know what is." Elena stared at him, feeling something shift deep inside her chest. For years she'd thought of herself as damaged, disfigured, less than whole. But David saw her scars as evidence of courage, her daily life as an act of resistance against prejudice and fear. "I never thought of it that way," she said quietly. "Maybe. It's time you started." David gathered his things, preparing to leave. "That budget meeting next Tuesday, I'll be there. And I won't be the only one." He headed toward the door, then paused. "Elena? That girl today called your scars gross. But you know what I see when I look at them." Elena shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see someone who ran toward danger to save another person. I see someone who survived something that would have broken others. I see someone beautiful." He met her eyes directly. "Beautiful because you survived. Beautiful because you chose to keep living. Beautiful because you turned your pain into purpose." David left then, stepping out into the late afternoon cold and leaving Elena standing alone in her library with tears streaming down her scarred face and something new blooming in her heart. The radical possibility that she might actually be worthy of love and respect exactly as she was. Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls, faster than Elena had anticipated. By Thursday morning, 3 days before the budget meeting, the library had become an unlikely focal point of community tension. Elena arrived to find Mrs. Patterson already at her desk, surrounded by phone message slips and wearing the kind of tight expression that meant trouble. 27 calls since yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Patterson announced without preamble. Some supporting you, some demanding we trim the budget. Margaret Thornton's been busy. Elena hung her coat on the hook behind the circulation desk, her stomach already churning with anxiety. What kind of calls? Mixed bag. The Hendersons want to know why we need 2 librarians when the county library in Millerville manages one. But Jake Murphy called to say he'd be at the meeting Tuesday, and so did Dr. Chun. Tommy Walsh's mother too apparently. Tommy came home Monday and announced that anyone who wanted to fire Miss Elena would have to get through him first. Despite her nervousness, Elena smiled at the image of 8-year-old Tommy defending her honor. What did you tell people who called? The truth. That circulation is up 30%, program attendance has tripled, and this library serves as a community center for half the town. But Elena ... Mrs. Patterson's voice grew serious. There's more going on here than budget concerns. Before Elena could ask what she meant, the front door opened with its familiar squeak. David entered carrying 2 coffee cups and what appeared to be a manila folder thick with papers. Morning, ladies. Brought reinforcements. He set 1 cup on Elena's desk and opened the folder. Spent yesterday evening doing some research of my own. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that seemed to promise better things ahead. What kind of research? The kind that shows. Margaret Thornton's husband owns 3 commercial properties on Main Street, including the building that houses the insurance agency. Been trying to get the town to approve a development project that would require relocating the library to make room for a shopping complex. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. How did you find that out? Public records at the county courthouse. Plus, I had a long conversation with Jake Murphy last night. Turns out there's been talk about this development for months, but the library's lease on this building runs for another 8 years. Can't break the lease without cause. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. So they're creating cause by eliminating my position. Makes the library look financially unstable, gives them grounds to argue the space is underutilized. David pulled out a sheet of paper covered with his careful handwriting. But here's what they don't know. I've been documenting library usage this week. Peak hours, patron demographics, program effectiveness. The numbers tell a different story than the one Margaret wants the council to hear. Elena stared at the data David had compiled, amazed by the thoroughness of his research. You did all this in 3 days? Military intelligence training. Plus, I had help. David's smile carried a hint of mischief. Turns out Mrs. Chun speaks excellent Korean, and her aunt who runs the restaurant has been keeping her own observations about who comes and goes from this building. Very detailed observations. Mrs. Patterson laughed despite the tension. Anna Chun doesn't miss anything that happens on Main Street. What did she tell you? Elena works longer hours than anyone else in town except Dr. Chun. That families drive in from other townships specifically for the children's programs. That the teenagers who used to loiter behind the hardware store now come here to do homework instead. David handed Elena another sheet of paper. And that 3 different book clubs meet here monthly, bringing in people who haven't socialized outside their own families in years. Elena read through David's notes, seeing her daily work reflected back in concrete statistics and observations. It was validating and overwhelming to discover that her efforts had been noticed, documented, valued by someone who'd taken the time to really look. This is incredible, David. Thank you. Not done yet. He pulled out a final document. Jake Murphy's been asking around the construction community. Turns out Thornton's development project has some serious flaws. Environmental impact studies show the proposed site has drainage issues that would cost more to fix than the whole project is worth. They need the library location because it's the only buildable space left on Main Street. Mrs. Patterson shook her head in disgust. So they're willing to destroy a vital community resource for a shopping complex that probably won't even succeed. Gets worse. I drove past the proposed site yesterday. It's the old Methodist church lot. Foundation's already compromised, which is why the church moved to their new building in the first place. Any developer with sense would avoid it. Elena felt anger building alongside her anxiety. Being targeted for her appearance was painful but familiar. Being manipulated for someone else's financial gain felt like a different kind of violation. Entirely. What can we do with this information? Present it at the budget meeting. Show the council that this isn't really about library costs. It's about real estate development and questionable financial decisions. David refolded his papers carefully. But Elena, you should know that Margaret's been spreading other stories too. What kind of stories? David hesitated, and Elena felt her stomach drop. She'd learned to recognize that pause, the careful consideration that preceded news she didn't want to hear. She's been suggesting that your appearance makes some parents uncomfortable bringing their children to library programs. Claims she's received complaints. The familiar shame washed over Elena like cold water. Despite David's encouragement and Mrs. Patterson's support, despite the children's easy acceptance and the growing sense that she might actually belong here, the old fears came rushing back. Have you received complaints? Elena asked Mrs. Patterson. Her voice smaller than she'd intended. Not a single one. In fact, I've gotten nothing but positive feedback about your work with children. But Elena ... Mrs. Patterson's expression grew fierce. Even if someone had complained, it wouldn't matter. You're an excellent librarian who happens to have scars. Anyone who can't see past that isn't worth worrying about. David nodded emphatically. Margaret's counting on you backing down without a fight. She's betting that you'll resign rather than face public scrutiny. Maybe she's right. Elena slumped against the circulation desk. Maybe it would be easier for everyone if I just don't. David's voice cut through her spiral of self-doubt with military precision. Don't you dare let them win by convincing you you're not worth fighting for. Elena looked up at him, seeing something fierce and protective in his expression that reminded her why he'd been a soldier. David, you don't understand what it's like to be stared at everywhere you go, to have people whisper about you, to wonder if children are going to be frightened. You're right. I don't understand that specific experience. David moved closer, his voice gentling. But I understand what it's like to have people decide your worth based on what's missing. I understand what it's like to be seen as a problem instead of a person. Mrs. Patterson stood up from her desk, her face flushed with indignation. Well, I understand what it's like to watch someone transform a dying institution into something vibrant and necessary. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let Margaret Thornton destroy that for a shopping mall nobody wants. Elena felt tears threatening but pushed them back. I don't want to be the cause of a town controversy. You're not the cause, David said firmly. You're the excuse. There's a difference. The morning proceeded with an unusual number of visitors. As if word of the brewing controversy had reminded people of how much they valued the library. Elena found herself busier than usual, helping patrons find books, answering research questions, and managing a constant stream of children who seemed drawn to the building despite it being winter vacation week. Around noon, Dr. Chun arrived with her Aunt Anna, both women carrying covered dishes that smelled wonderfully of garlic and ginger. Lunch, Dr. Chun announced, setting containers on the reading table. Anna insisted we bring enough for everyone. Anna Chun, a small woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, surveyed the library with obvious approval. She spoke rapidly in Korean to her niece, who translated with a smile. She says this place has good energy now. When the old librarian worked here, it felt empty even when there were people in it. Now it feels alive. Elena accepted a container of what appeared to be Korean beef stew with profound gratitude. Please tell her thank you for the food and for the kind words. Anna Chun spoke again, her tone more serious. Dr. Chun listened carefully before translating. She says Margaret Thornton came to the restaurant yesterday, trying to get Anna to sign a petition supporting the budget cuts. Anna told her the library is one of the few places in town where everyone is welcome, regardless of how they look or how much money they have. Then she asked Margaret to leave. David grinned at this news. I like your aunt. Anna doesn't tolerate bullies. Never has. Dr. Chun settled into a chair with her own lunch. She also wanted you to know that several other business owners have been approached about the petition. Most of them refused to sign. Elena felt a flutter of hope. Really? Jim Peterson at the bakery told Margaret that anyone who wanted to get rid of the best children's librarian the town had ever had could find somewhere else to buy their morning coffee. And George Rodriguez said his family research project would have been impossible without your help. Mrs. Patterson beamed with satisfaction. Elena, you've touched more lives than you realize. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Jessica Thornton, Margaret's 18-year-old daughter, arriving alone and looking uncomfortable. Elena braced herself for another unpleasant encounter, but Jessica approached the circulation desk with something that might have been embarrassment. Miss Morrison, I was wondering if you could help me find some books about facial reconstruction surgery and recovery. Elena blinked in surprise. Of course. Is this for a research project? Sort of. Jessica glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. My boyfriend at college, he was in a car accident over Christmas break. He's having surgery next week, and I want to understand what he's going through. Elena felt her perspective on Jessica shift completely. That must be frightening for both of you. He's worried I won't want to be with him anymore if he looks different. Jessica's voice was small, younger than her 18 years. I don't know how to convince him that I don't care about scars. Elena led Jessica to the medical section, pulling books about reconstructive surgery, trauma recovery, and supporting loved ones through difficult times. As she worked, she found herself sharing insights from her own experience, the importance of patience during healing, the way pain could make people withdraw, the need for honest communication about fears and expectations. The thing is, Elena said quietly as she handed Jessica the books, scars tell stories. They're proof that someone survived something difficult. Your boyfriend is still the same person he was before the accident. He just has new chapters in his story now. Jessica nodded, tears visible in her eyes. I heard what Mom said about you at the town meeting. About parents being uncomfortable. I wanted you to know that's not true. My little cousin Mason loves coming to storytime here. He tells everyone you're the nicest lady in town. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you for telling me that. And Miss Morrison? I'm sorry about what I said the other day, about your scars being gross. That was stupid and mean, and I'm really sorry. Apology accepted. We all say things we regret sometimes. After Jessica left with her armload of books, Elena found David waiting at the circulation desk with an expression of quiet pride. Overheard that conversation. You handled it beautifully. She's not a bad kid. Just young and scared about someone she cares about, like someone else I know. David's meaning was clear. Elena, what you just did helping that girl understand that scars don't change who someone is. That's exactly why this town needs you. Elena felt something shift inside her, a straightening of her spine and a lifting of her head. For the first time since Margaret Thornton's budget announcement, she felt ready to fight for her place here. The meeting's Tuesday night, she said. It is and will be ready. Elena looked around the library at Mrs. Patterson organizing the new book display, at the reading areas she'd created, at the children's section that had become a hub of activity and learning. This place wasn't just her job anymore. It was her calling, her contribution to making the world a little better. Yes, she said with growing conviction, we will be. Tuesday evening arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of Cedar Falls Town Hall and sent loose papers skittering across the parking lot. Elena stood outside the brick building at 10 minutes to 7, watching cars arrive and trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. She'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on a navy blue blazer and white blouse that she hoped projected competence and professionalism. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, no longer hiding behind the curtain she usually arranged to obscure her scars. David appeared at her elbow, solid and reassuring in a dark suit that transformed him from casual newcomer to formidable presence. You ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be. Elena clutched the folder containing her prepared remarks and supporting documents. I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Stop thinking about what could go wrong and start thinking about what's already gone right. David gestured toward the parking lot, where more cars were arriving than typically attended town council meetings. Look around. Half the town is here. Elena followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. Jake Murphy was climbing out of his pickup truck, followed by his wife and teenage son. Dr. Chun walked across the lot with her Aunt Anna, both women moving with the determined stride of people prepared for battle. The Hendersons approached the building with their 3 children in tow, including 8-year-old Tommy, who spotted Elena and waved enthusiastically. Miss Elena, Tommy called out, breaking away from his family to run toward her. Dad says we're here to make sure nobody fires you. Elena knelt down to Tommy's level, touched by his fierce loyalty. Thank you for coming, Tommy. It means more than you know. I brought this for you, Tommy said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket. It's a picture of you reading stories. Mom helped me write something on the back. Elena unfolded the paper to reveal a crayon drawing of herself sitting in the library's children's section, surrounded by stick-figure children with enormous smiles. On the back, in a child's careful handwriting, Miss Elena is the best librarian ever. She makes reading fun, and she's not scary even though some grown-ups think she is. The end. Tommy, this is beautiful, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll treasure it always. Mrs. Patterson emerged from a car near the building's entrance, followed by Jim Peterson from the bakery and George Rodriguez with his wife, Maria. Even Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church was approaching the doors, moving slowly with his cane but clearly determined to attend. Elena, David said quietly, whatever happens in there, remember that these people aren't here by accident. They're here because you matter to them. The interior of the town hall was warm and buzzing with conversation. The main meeting room held about 60 folding chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where the 5 council members would sit. Elena was surprised to see that nearly half the chairs were already occupied, with more people filing in steadily. Margaret Thornton held court near the front of the room, speaking in low, urgent tones to a cluster of supporters that included her husband Robert and several other business owners Elena didn't recognize. Margaret's expression grew tight when she noticed Elena's arrival, and she whispered something to Robert that made him turn to stare openly at Elena's face. Ignore them, David murmured, guiding Elena towards seats in the middle section where Mrs. Patterson was saving space. Focus on your supporters. As Elena settled into her chair, she was amazed by the familiar faces surrounding her. The Walsh family occupied an entire row, with Tommy already coloring in a book his mother had brought. To keep him occupied, Dr. Chun and Anna sat directly behind Elena, Anna nodding approvingly when Elena turned to acknowledge them. Jake Murphy had positioned himself near the aisle where his broad shoulders and crossed arms created an intimidating presence. At exactly 7 o'clock, Council President Harold Marison, no relation to Elena despite the shared surname, called the meeting to order. The 5 council members took their seats at the front table, Harold in the center, flanked by Margaret Thornton, elderly Fred Watkins, newcomer Sandra Davies, and long-serving member Bill Harper. First order of business, Harold announced, is the proposed budget amendment regarding library staffing. Margaret Thornton has requested time to present the case for reducing personnel costs. Margaret rose from her seat with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. She dressed carefully for the occasion in a burgundy suit that projected authority, and she carried a leather portfolio that she placed on the small podium with theatrical precision. Fellow citizens, Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. We gather tonight to discuss responsible fiscal management in challenging times. While we all value our library, we must ask ourselves whether we can justify the expense of 2 full-time librarian positions when surrounding communities manage effectively with 1. Elena felt her palms grow damp as Margaret continued her presentation. The arguments were carefully crafted statistics about per capita library costs, comparisons to other towns, projections about budget savings that could be redirected to road maintenance and snow removal. Furthermore, Margaret said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, we must consider whether our current staffing arrangement serves the best interests of our community's families. I've spoken with parents who express concern about the appropriateness of certain staff members working directly with young children. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Elena felt her face burn with shame and anger. Margaret wasn't mentioning her by name, but everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. Now I want to be clear, Margaret continued with false sympathy. This isn't about personal character or dedication. It's simply about recognizing that some individuals may be better suited to behind-the-scenes work rather than public-facing positions that require extensive interaction with impressionable young minds. Elena's hands clenched in her lap. The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the cruelty of the attack. Margaret was essentially arguing that Elena's appearance made her unfit to work with children. The solution is simple and economical, Margaret concluded. We maintain Mrs. Patterson as head librarian and eliminate the assistant position, saving the community approximately $42,000 annually that can be better used for essential services. Margaret returned to her seat with a satisfied smile, clearly confident she'd made her case effectively. Harold Morrison looked around the room with the weary expression of someone who'd been through many such meetings. The floor is now open for public comment. Please state your name clearly. For the record. Elena's heart pounded as David stood up. She'd known he planned to speak but hadn't expected him to go first. David Blackwood, he said, moving to the podium with military bearing. I'm new to Cedar Falls, which means I can offer an outsider's perspective on this issue. David pulled out his carefully prepared notes and placed them on the podium. I've spent the past week studying library usage patterns, and the numbers tell a clear story. Since Elena Morrison began working here 3 years ago, circulation has increased by 31%. Children's program attendance has tripled. Adult literacy classes have been established. 3 different book clubs now meet regularly, serving demographics from senior citizens to working mothers to teenagers. Elena watched the council members' faces as David presented his data. Sandra Davies was taking notes, clearly engaged with the information. Bill Harper leaned forward with interest. Even Fred Watkins, who typically dozed through meetings, seemed alert and attentive. More importantly, David continued, I've observed Elena Morrison's interactions with library patrons, particularly children. Her skill in connecting young readers with appropriate materials is exceptional. She demonstrates infinite patience, genuine enthusiasm for literature, and an intuitive understanding of how to make reading enjoyable rather than mandatory. David paused, looking directly at Margaret Thornton. As for concerns about her appropriateness working with children, I can only say that anyone who's witnessed her sorry time sessions would recognize immediately that children respond to her with trust, affection, and excitement about learning. Elena felt tears threatening as David defended her so eloquently, but he wasn't finished. I'm a combat veteran who lost my arm in Afghanistan, David said, his voice carrying new intensity. I know something about how people react to visible differences. I also know something about courage under fire. Elena Morrison runs toward danger to help others. She proved that when she saved her neighbor from a house fire. She demonstrates that same courage every day by choosing to serve this community despite facing prejudice and judgment from people who should know better. David gathered his notes and looked directly at Elena. Beautiful doesn't mean unmarked. Beautiful means survived. Beautiful means to keep fighting. Beautiful means turned pain into purpose. Elena Morrison is beautiful in all the ways that actually matter. The room erupted in applause as David returned to his seat. Elena felt overwhelmed by his public declaration, by the support evident in the clapping that seemed to go on forever. Dr. Chun rose next. Her voice calm and professional as she spoke about Elena's assistance with medical research requests and her creation of health literacy programs for seniors. Jake Murphy followed, describing how Elena had helped his son with special needs find books that matched his interests and reading level. My boy struggles with learning differences, Jake said gruffly. Most people get impatient with him, treat him like he's stupid. Elena sees his potential and finds ways to help him succeed. Anyone who thinks she shouldn't work with children doesn't understand what children actually need. Tommy Walsh's mother stood up without waiting to be called. My son comes home from library story time excited about books and reading in ways I never expected. Elena Morrison has given him a love of literature that will benefit him for life. The idea that her appearance somehow makes her unsuitable to work with children is not only cruel, it's stupid. The testimonials continued for nearly an hour. George Rodriguez spoke about Elena's assistance with his family history research. Jim Peterson described how she'd helped organize a reading program for elderly residents at the assisted living facility. Even Pastor William struggled to the podium to talk about Elena's quiet contributions to community literacy efforts. But it was Anna Chun who delivered the most powerful moment of the evening. The elderly Korean woman approached the podium with her niece translating, but when she began to speak, it was in heavily accented but clear English. "I come to America 40 years ago," Anna said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "People stare because I look different, talk different. Some places I am not welcome because my face reminds them I am foreign." Anna's eyes found Elena in the crowd. This girl knows what it is like to be judged by how you look instead of what you do, but she chooses every day to be kind, to help people, to make the community better. Her scars tell a story of courage. People who cannot see this, they are the ones with the problem, not her. The room fell silent as Anna returned to her seat. Elena wiped tears from her cheeks, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people she'd often felt were merely tolerating her presence. Margaret Thornton requested time for rebuttal, her face flushed with anger at how the evening had unfolded. "While these testimonials are touching," she said with barely concealed frustration, "they don't address the fundamental budget reality we're facing. Sentiment doesn't balance spreadsheets." "Neither does greed," someone called out from the back of the room. Harold Morrison gavelled for order. "We'll have no outbursts. Margaret, please continue. The truth is that we can maintain library services with one qualified librarian. The assistant position is a luxury we can no longer afford." Margaret's voice grew harder. "And we must consider whether having someone with visible differences in a customer service role creates discomfort for some community members." Jake Murphy stood up without waiting for permission. "Anyone uncomfortable with Elena's appearance can take their business elsewhere. The rest of us appreciate having someone who actually cares about doing good work." This time Harold didn't gavel for order as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elena could see that the mood in the room had shifted decisively against Margaret's proposal. Finally, Harold called for Elena herself to speak. She approached the podium on unsteady legs, her prepared remarks suddenly seeming inadequate for the moment. "3 years ago," Elena began, her voice stronger than she'd expected, "I came to Cedar Falls planning to teach elementary school. Fire changed those plans, but it led me to work I love deeply." Elena looked out at the faces in the crowd, some supportive, some neutral, a few openly hostile. "I won't pretend that having visible scars is easy. Children ask honest questions, which I answer honestly. Adults sometimes stare or look away, which I've learned to accept." She found David's eyes in the crowd and drew strength from his steady gaze. "But what I've discovered here is that a community's character isn't measured by how it treats people who fit in perfectly. It's measured by how it treats people who are different, who've survived something difficult, who might not look like everyone else but who have something valuable to contribute." Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I love this library. I love helping children discover books that will shape their imaginations. I love assisting patrons with research that matters to them. I love being part of something that makes this community richer and more connected." She paused, gathering courage for her final words. "If you eliminate my position to save money, I understand. But if you eliminate it because you think my scars make me unfit to serve this community, then you're not just firing me, you're telling every child who feels different that their worth depends on their appearance. You're saying that survival isn't beautiful, that courage doesn't matter, that people like me don't belong." Elena returned to her seat amid thunderous applause that seemed to shake the building's old windows. The council members huddled in whispered conversation while the crowd waited in tense silence. Finally, Harold Morrison called for the vote. "All in favor of eliminating the assistant librarian position?" Margaret Thornton raised her hand immediately. Fred Watkins hesitated, then slowly raised his as well. Opposed? Sandra Davies, Bill Harper, and Harold Morrison himself raised their hands with decisive firmness. Motion fails, 3-2. The library will maintain current staffing levels. The room erupted in cheers and applause that continued for several minutes. Elena felt David's hand squeeze her shoulder as supporters surrounded her with congratulations and expressions of relief. Margaret Thornton gathered her materials with obvious fury, her face tight with the rage of someone unaccustomed to public defeat. As she passed Elena's row on her way to the exit, she leaned down and hissed, "This isn't over." But Elena, surrounded by friends and supported by a community that had chosen to value her contributions over her appearance, found she wasn't afraid of Margaret's threats anymore. For the first time in years, she felt truly beautiful, not despite her scars, but because of everything they represented about her strength, her courage, and her refusal to let other people's limitations define her worth. The morning after the town council meeting dawned bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the library's tall windows and illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the warming air. Elena arrived an hour early, as had become her custom. But this time she found herself moving differently through the familiar space. Her shoulders were straighter, her head held higher, and when she caught her reflection in the glass doors, she didn't immediately turn away from the sight of her scarred face. She was arranging the morning newspaper display when the first surprise visitor arrived. Jessica Thornton stood outside the locked door, shifting nervously from foot to foot and clutching what appeared to be a handwritten letter. Elena unlocked the door with curiosity rather than the dread she might have felt a week earlier. "Jessica? Is everything all right?" The 18-year-old stepped inside, her usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. "I wanted to apologize for what my mother said last night about you being inappropriate to work with children. That was cruel and wrong, and I'm ashamed. She's my mother." Elena felt a surge of sympathy for the girl, who was clearly struggling with divided loyalties. "You don't need to apologize for your mother's actions, Jessica." "Yes, I do." Jessica held out the letter with hands that trembled slightly. "My boyfriend Tyler, the one who was in the car accident, he's coming home from the hospital today. I've been so worried about how people will react to his scars, and then I watched my own mother attack you for the same thing. It made me realize I've been part of the problem." Elena accepted the letter, noting the careful handwriting that spoke of multiple drafts and serious consideration. "What do you mean?" "I've been one of those people who stare and whisper. Not just about you, but about anyone who looks different. Mr. Henderson with his prosthetic leg, Maria Santos with her birthmark, even Jake Murphy's son because he learns differently." Jessica's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Last night, I realized that if I can't handle people staring at Tyler, then maybe I need to stop staring at others." Elena unfolded the letter to find a thoughtful essay about empathy, acceptance, and the courage required to see past surface appearances. It was clearly written by someone who'd done serious self-reflection about her own biases and behavior. "This is very insightful, Jessica. Thank you for sharing it. There's more. I talked to some friends from high school who are home from college, and we want to do something. A project or program that helps people understand that differences aren't scary." Jessica's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm of youth discovering purpose. "Would you help us? Maybe we could organize something here at the library." Elena felt touched by the request and the transformation it represented. "I'd be honored to help. What did you have in mind? Maybe a speaker series or workshops about disability awareness? Tyler says there are other veterans in the area dealing with visible injuries. And Dr. Chen mentioned there's a support group for burn survivors that meets in Millerville. Maybe some of them would be willing to share their stories." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Patterson's arrival, followed closely by David. carrying 2 coffee cups and what had become his customary breakfast offerings. The morning routine that had developed over the past weeks felt different now. Less like Elena accepting charity and more like friends sharing the start of a new day. "Jessica Thornton," Mrs. Patterson said with surprise. "This is unexpected. I was just asking Miss Morrison to help us organize some community education programs," Jessica explained, "about acceptance and understanding differences." David handed Elena her coffee with a smile that suggested he'd overheard enough to understand the significance of Jessica's request. "Sounds like last night's meeting accomplished more than just saving Elena's job." "It made me think about who I want to be," Jessica said simply. "Someone who makes the world more welcoming for people like Tyler, not someone who makes it harder." After Jessica left with promises to return later with her friends, Elena found herself reflecting on the unexpected nature of change she'd expected. The council meeting to determine whether she kept her job, but it seemed to have triggered something much larger, a shift in how the community saw not just her, but the whole question of belonging and acceptance. The morning brought a steady stream of patrons, many of whom made a point of stopping by the circulation desk to express their support for Elena and their satisfaction with the previous night's outcome. Mr. Rodriguez brought his wife Maria, who'd rarely visited the library before but wanted to thank Elena personally for her help with their family research. "George talks about you all the time," Maria said warmly. "How patient you are with his questions, how you remember exactly what he's looking for from week to week. You've helped him connect with his heritage in ways I never expected." Even more surprising was the arrival of Pastor Williams, moving slowly with his cane, but clearly determined to make the trip. "Elena, my dear," he said in his creaky voice, "I wanted you to know that Sunday's sermon will be about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about how the person who looked different was the one who showed true compassion." Elena felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but also by a growing sense of responsibility. People were looking to her as an example of resilience and grace under pressure. It was both humbling and slightly terrifying. The afternoon brought David's return from his construction work, covered in sawdust and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd accomplished meaningful tasks with his hands. He'd been helping Jake Murphy renovate the interior of the old Peterson bakery, transforming it into expanded office space for the insurance agency that currently occupied the cramped second floor. "Jake says the work's going so well that he wants to bid on the library's accessibility renovation project," David reported, settling into his usual reading chair with a technical manual about universal design principles. "Ramps, wider doorways, better lighting make this place truly welcoming for everyone." Elena looked around the library with new eyes, noticing for the first time how the narrow entrance and steep steps to the children's basement area might present challenges for patrons with mobility issues. "I never thought about accessibility improvements. Most people don't until they need them. But Jake's son uses a wheelchair sometimes when his cerebral palsy symptoms are worse, so Jake notices things others miss." The conversation reminded Elena of how many forms of difference existed in their small community, visible and invisible, temporary and permanent, chosen and imposed by circumstance. Her scars were just one part of a much larger spectrum of human variation that people struggled to understand and accept. Around 4 o'clock, Anna Chun arrived with her niece Dr. Chun and what appeared to be a delegation of other Korean Americans from the surrounding area. Elena recognized the restaurant owner from Millerville and a nurse from the county hospital, but several faces were unfamiliar. "Anna wanted to introduce you to the Regional Korean American Association," Dr. Chun explained. "She's been telling everyone about your speech last night, and they're interested in partnering with the library on cultural exchange programs." Anna Chun spoke rapidly in Korean, gesturing expressively and clearly pleased about something. Dr. Chun translated with a smile. "She says you understand what it means to be judged by appearance instead of character." She thinks this makes you the perfect person to help bridge cultural differences in the community. Elena felt honored by Anna's confidence, but uncertain about her qualifications. I don't know much about Korean culture. But you know about respect and inclusion, Dr. Chun replied. Anna thinks that's more important than cultural knowledge, which can be learned. The group spent an hour discussing possibilities: Korean cooking classes, language exchange programs, cultural celebration events that could help the growing Asian American population feel more welcomed in Cedar Falls. Elena found herself energized by the prospect of expanding the library's role as a community gathering place. Evening brought an unexpected phone call from Margaret Thornton, her voice tight with controlled anger. Elena, we need to talk. Elena felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety, but David's steady presence across the room reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone anymore. What can I do for you, Margaret? You can stop spreading lies about my husband's development project. The information that the veteran presented last night was completely out of context. Elena frowned, genuinely confused. David didn't lie about anything. Public records are exactly that, public. Don't play innocent with me. You've been plotting against me since you arrived in this town, trying to position yourself as some kind of victim to gain sympathy. The accusation was so far from Elena's actual experience that she almost laughed. Margaret, I've spent 3 years trying to be invisible. If I'd been plotting anything, it would have been to avoid attention entirely. Well, you've got attention now. And you should know that this isn't over. There are other ways to deal with personnel problems. The threat was vague but unmistakable. Elena felt a chill of fear, but underneath it was something new: anger at being threatened for simply existing and doing her job well. Is there anything else? Elena asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Margaret ended the call without another word, leaving Elena staring at the phone and wondering what new challenges lay ahead. Trouble? David asked from his reading chair. Margaret's not giving up. She seems to think I've been orchestrating some kind of campaign against her. David closed his book and moved to sit across from Elena's desk. Paranoid people often assume others are as manipulative as they are. She can't understand that you genuinely earned people's support by being good at your job and kind to others. Elena nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's threats weren't empty. What do you think she'd try next? Hard to say, but Elena, you're not facing this alone anymore. Last night proved that this community values what you bring to it. That's not something she can undo with threats and manipulation. The weekend brought a development that surprised everyone in town. Elena arrived at the library Saturday morning to find Jake Murphy's truck parked outside, along with several other vehicles she didn't recognize. Jake met her at the door with a clipboard and what appeared to be building plans. Hope you don't mind us starting early, Jake said. Got a crew here volunteering their weekend to begin the accessibility improvements. Figured we should strike while the iron's hot. Elena stared at the bustle of activity contractors measuring doorways, discussing ramp angles, and examining the basement stairs with professional attention. Jake, this is wonderful, but who's paying for all this? Community fund. Started Thursday morning after word got around about the accessibility idea. Anna Chun kicked it off with a $1,000 donation, then it snowballed. We've got enough. Pledged to do the whole renovation properly. Elena felt tears threatening at this unexpected generosity. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. Jake consulted his clipboard. We'll work around your schedule, but by the end of the month, this place will be accessible to everyone in the community. The sight of the renovation work drew curious onlookers throughout the day. Elena found herself explaining the accessibility improvements to patron after patron, many of whom expressed enthusiasm for making the library more welcoming to people with different needs. Sunday afternoon brought perhaps the biggest surprise of all. Elena was reading in her apartment when she heard voices in the alley behind the building. Looking out her window, she saw a group of teenagers setting up what appeared to be an outdoor art project. Jessica Thornton was directing the activity. With the focused energy of someone on a mission, Elena went downstairs to investigate and found the group creating a large mural on the blank wall of the building adjacent to the library. The design incorporated books, diverse faces, and words in multiple languages, spelling out concepts like welcome, belonging, and strength through differences. "We got permission from the building owner," Jessica explained when she noticed Elena watching. "Tyler's an art major, and he designed this as a way to make a public statement about inclusion. We want everyone to know that Cedar Falls welcomes people who are different." Elena studied the mural in progress, noting how Tyler incorporated elements that celebrated various forms of diversity, disability, ethnicity, age, and economic status. Despite the facial scars from his accident, he worked with confidence and joy, clearly energized by the project's positive message. "This is incredible," Elena said. "How long will it take to complete?" 2 weeks if the weather holds," Tyler replied, pausing in his painting to smile at Elena. "Jessica told me about your speech at the council meeting, about how a community's character is measured by how it treats people who are different. We wanted to make that message visible." As Elena watched the young people work on their mural, she realized that the council meeting had been just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The community was actively choosing to become more welcoming, more inclusive, more aware of how their actions affected others. The ripple effects of standing up for herself were spreading far beyond what Elena had ever imagined possible. And for the first time since the fire that had changed her life, she felt not just accepted, but truly valued for exactly who she was. Scars and all. 6 months after the town council meeting that changed everything, Elena Morrison stood before the mirror in her apartment bathroom and did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She smiled at her reflection without looking away. The scars were still there, tracing their familiar pattern down the left side of her face, but they no longer dominated what she saw. Instead, she noticed the brightness in her eyes, the confident set of her shoulders, the way her whole face seemed to glow with purpose and contentment. Today marked the grand reopening of the Cedar Falls Public Library after its accessibility renovation, and Elena had chosen to wear a sleeveless summer dress in pale yellow that left her arm scars fully visible. The decision would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Her scars were part of her story, and she'd learned that stories worth telling didn't need to be hidden. The morning air carried the sweet scent of summer roses as Elena walked the 3 blocks to the library, stopping frequently to greet neighbors who called out congratulations about the day's celebration. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery handed her a coffee and refused payment, as had become their weekend ritual. The Hendersons waved from their front porch with 8-year-old Tommy racing down to give Elena the fierce hug that had become his standard greeting. "Miss Elena, are you excited about today?" Tommy asked, his gap-toothed grin infectious with enthusiasm. "Very excited." "Are you ready for your speech?" Tommy had been selected to represent the children's programs at the reopening ceremony, a responsibility he took with utmost seriousness. "I practiced in front of the mirror just like you taught me. Mom says I sound very professional." Elena ruffled his hair affectionately. "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully." The library building itself had been transformed beyond recognition. The steep front steps had been replaced with a graceful ramp that curved around a newly planted garden featuring native Minnesota wildflowers and herbs. The heavy oak doors had been widened and fitted with automatic openers that responded to both motion sensors and accessible buttons. Large windows had been added to fill the interior with natural light, and the entire children's section had been moved to the main floor in a bright, welcoming space designed specifically for young readers. Elena unlocked the renovated entrance and stepped inside, still marveling at how much had changed. The circulation desk was now height adjustable to accommodate patrons using wheelchairs. Braille signage complemented the large print directional signs throughout the building. A quiet study room had been equipped with assistive technology for patrons with visual or hearing impairments. The new elevator provided access to the basement level, which had been converted into a multi-purpose community room for meetings, cultural events, and expanded programming. David Blackwood emerged from the community room carrying a ladder and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd been working productively since dawn. He'd arrived 2 hours early to help set up the sound system for the day's speakers, continuing the pattern of quietly supportive presence that had defined their friendship and, increasingly, their relationship over the past months. "How's everything looking downstairs?" Elena asked, accepting the brief kiss he offered along with his morning greeting. "Perfect." Jake's crew finished the last of the paint touch-ups, and the AV equipment is working flawlessly. Dr. Chun and Anna are already arranging food tables, and I spotted Jessica and Tyler setting up the art display. Elena felt a warm flutter of anticipation. The reopening celebration had grown far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned, becoming a community-wide festival that would showcase not just the library's improvements, but the broader transformation that had taken place in Cedar Falls. Over the past 6 months, Mrs. Patterson arrived shortly after 9, followed by a steady stream of volunteers carrying flowers, food, and decorations. The Korean American Association had prepared traditional dishes to share, alongside the potluck contributions from other community members. Jessica Thornton and her boyfriend Tyler had organized an art exhibition featuring works by local artists with disabilities, including several stunning pieces by Tyler himself that incorporated themes of resilience and beauty found in unexpected places. The morning's preparation buzzed with the energy of people working toward a shared goal. Alina moved through the library helping coordinate various activities, but more often simply observing the remarkable transformation that had taken place in her community. Jake Murphy's son Daniel, who used a wheelchair on his more difficult days, navigated the space easily and with obvious delight at its accessibility. Anna Chun directed the food setup with the authority of someone accustomed to organizing large events, switching seamlessly between Korean and English as she coordinated with volunteers. At 11 o'clock, the first official guests began arriving. For the noon ceremony, the mayor of Millerville came with several county officials who'd been following Cedar Falls accessibility initiatives with interest. Representatives from the State Library Association had driven up from Minneapolis to document the renovation project for their newsletter. Most importantly, members of the regional disability advocacy community had accepted invitations to attend, including several veterans from David's support group and participants in the Burn Survivor Network that Elena had recently joined. Elena greeted each group of visitors, amazed by her own confidence in serving as the library spokesperson. 6 months ago, she would have hidden behind Mrs. Patterson during such events. Now she found herself naturally taking the lead, explaining the renovation features and describing the programming expansions with genuine enthusiasm. The ceremony itself began at noon with Harold Morrison, the council president, offering opening remarks about community investment and shared values. He acknowledged that the accessibility improvements represented more than physical changes. They symbolized Cedar Falls' commitment to ensuring that every resident could participate fully in community. Mrs. Patterson spoke next, describing the library's evolution from a struggling institution to a vibrant community hub. She credited Alina's vision and dedication, but also emphasized how the transformation had required support from the entire town. A library is only as strong as the community it serves, Mrs. Patterson said, looking out at the crowd of nearly 200 people gathered in the main reading area. And this community has shown remarkable strength, not just in funding these improvements, but in choosing inclusion over exclusion, understanding over fear. Tommy Walsh took the podium next with the serious demeanor of someone delivering important news. Before Miss Elena came to work here, I didn't like reading very much, he began, his clear voice carrying throughout the room. Books seemed boring and hard. But Miss Elena taught me that books are like doors to other worlds, and reading is like having superpowers that let you go anywhere and be anyone. Tommy paused to look directly at Elena before continuing. Some grown-ups thought Miss Elena shouldn't work with kids because she looks different. But kids don't care about scars. We care about people who are nice to us and help us learn new things. Miss Elena is the best teacher I ever had, and anyone who thinks scars make someone scary is just being silly. The 8-year-old straightforward. Assessment drew laughter and applause from the crowd, but Elena felt the deeper truth in his words. Children had been her most consistent supporters throughout her struggles in Cedar Falls, accepting her appearance with the matter-of-fact wisdom that adults seem to lose somewhere along the way. Jessica Thornton spoke next, representing the youth volunteers who had organized several community service projects inspired by the library renovation. 6 months ago, I was one of those people who stared at differences instead of celebrating them, Jessica said with the honest self-reflection that had characterized her transformation. The night of the budget meeting, I watched this community choose kindness over prejudice, and it made me want to be better. Jessica described the various initiatives that had emerged from that pivotal evening. The inclusion awareness workshops now offered monthly at the library. The peer mentorship program connecting teenagers with and without disabilities. The cultural exchange events that had brought together Korean-American families with longtime Cedar Falls residents. Change starts with individuals choosing to see each other clearly, Jessica concluded. Elena Morrison helped us understand that being different isn't something to hide or fix, it's something to honor and learn from. Dr. Chun addressed the crowd on behalf of the Korean American Association, speaking about the warm welcome their community had received in Cedar Falls and their excitement about future collaboration. Anna Chun stood beside her granddaughter, beaming with pride at the successful cultural bridge building that had transformed relationships throughout the region. Elena's turn came to speak. She approached the podium with the composed confidence that had gradually replaced her old habits of self-consciousness and invisibility. The crowd fell silent with respectful attention, and Elena looked out at faces that had become dear to her, supporters who had defended her, skeptics who had become allies, and children who had never seen her as anything other than their beloved librarian. 5 years ago, Elena began, I believed that the fire that scarred my face had taken away my future. I thought beauty meant unmarked skin, and that worth meant being comfortable for others to look at. I built my life around making myself as invisible as possible, convinced that hiding was the same thing as surviving. Elena paused, finding David's eyes in the crowd and drawing strength from his steady gaze. But hiding isn't surviving. Surviving means choosing to live fully despite pain. Surviving means turning wounds into wisdom, isolation into empathy, fear into courage. Surviving means understanding that true beauty has nothing to do with perfection, and everything to do with the decision to keep growing, keep learning, keep contributing to something larger than yourself. She gestured toward the renovated library space around them. This building is more beautiful now than it was before the renovation, not because it's newer or more expensive, but because it's more welcoming. It serves more people, creates more opportunities, builds more connections. The same is true for communities and for individuals. We become beautiful not by avoiding difficulty, but by choosing how we respond to it. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. 6 months ago, I thought I was fighting to save my job. But what I was really fighting for was the right to belong exactly as I am. And in standing up for that right, I discovered something amazing, a community full of people who were also struggling to belong, also learning to see past surface differences, also choosing courage over comfort. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Elena felt the weight of their attention not as pressure, but as connection, as evidence of the bonds that had formed through honesty and mutual support. The children who attend story time here don't see my scars as frightening or inappropriate. They see them as part of my story, the way Tommy's gap-toothed smile is part of his story, or Anna Chan's accent is part of hers. Children understand instinctively that our differences make us interesting, not inferior. Elena looked specifically at several adult faces in the crowd, people who had initially struggled with her appearance, but had gradually learned to see past surface impressions. Adults have to work harder to remember this truth. We get trained to fear difference, to mistake unfamiliar for threatening. But we can retrain ourselves. We can choose curiosity over judgment, understanding over assumption, inclusion over exclusion. She found Margaret Thornton in the back of the room, noting with surprise that her former antagonist had attended the ceremony. Margaret's expression was unreadable, but her presence suggested at least a willingness to witness the community's transformation. This library renovation represents more than accessibility improvements, Elena continued. It represents our commitment to ensuring that everyone in this community can participate fully in our shared life. The ramps and elevators serve people with mobility challenges. The assistive technology serves people with visual or hearing impairments. The multilingual signage serves families who speak languages other than English. But really, all of these improvements serve everyone, because they demonstrate that we value inclusion over exclusion, access over barriers, welcome over rejection. Elena's conclusion drew from the deepest truth she'd learned through her journey. Beautiful doesn't mean perfect. Beautiful means survived. Beautiful means to keep fighting. Beautiful means turned pain into purpose, wounds into wisdom, isolation into connection. Beautiful means decided that your worth isn't determined by other people's comfort level with your appearance. She looked out at David, at Mrs. Patterson, at Tommy and Jessica and Anna Chun, and all the others who had supported her transformation. Thank you for teaching me that I am beautiful exactly as I am. Thank you for showing me that belonging isn't something you have to earn. By changing yourself, it's something you claim by having the courage to be yourself. The applause that followed Elena's speech seemed to last forever, building in intensity. As people rose to their feet in a standing ovation that felt like a collective affirmation of everything she'd said. Elena felt tears streaming down her scarred face, but they were tears of joy and gratitude rather than shame or sorrow. After the formal ceremony ended, the celebration continued with food, music, and informal conversations that spilled out into the newly landscaped grounds. Elena moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and expressions of gratitude, but also simply enjoying the relaxed socializing that had become natural in her life. David appeared at her side as the afternoon began to wind down, offering his arm as they walked together through the community garden that had been planted alongside the library's accessibility ramp. The flowers were blooming beautifully despite, or perhaps because of the diverse mix of native species that had been chosen for their hardiness and ability to thrive in challenging conditions. Penny for your thoughts, David said as they settled on a bench overlooking the garden. Elena considered the question seriously. I was thinking about how much has changed since that morning you first walked into the library. Not just the building or the programs, but the whole feeling of this place. You mean the feeling of belonging? That, but also the feeling of possibility. 6 months ago, I thought the best I could hope for was to be tolerated despite my differences. Now I understand that my differences are part of what I bring to this community. They're not obstacles to overcome, they're perspectives to value. David nodded, understanding her meaning immediately. Your scars made you more empathetic, not less valuable. Your struggles with acceptance made you better at creating welcoming spaces for others. Elena leaned against his shoulder, grateful for the steady presence that had anchored her transformation. What about you? Do you feel like you belong here now? More than I've belonged anywhere since leaving the army. This place gave me a chance to discover who I am when I'm not defined by what I've lost. They sat in comfortable silence, watching families explore the library's new features and teenagers gather around Tyler's art display. The scene felt peaceful and purposeful, like a community that had learned to appreciate its own diversity. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Elena found herself thinking about the future with excitement rather than anxiety. The library had become a model for inclusive design that was attracting attention from other communities interested in similar renovations. Elena had been invited to speak at a state conference about accessibility and community engagement. Most importantly, the programs and partnerships that had grown out of the past 6 months were creating ongoing opportunities for connection and growth. The Korean language classes that Anna Chun taught on Tuesday evenings were always full. Disability awareness workshops had expanded to include sessions on various topics, from autism acceptance to veterans issues. The children's programs had tripled in size and now included adaptive storytelling for kids with special needs. The adult literacy program served both native English speakers who had missed educational opportunities and immigrants learning to navigate their new country. Margaret Thornton approached Elena as she was preparing to lock up the library for the evening. The encounter Elena had been dreading all day came with surprising gentleness. "Elena," Margaret said formally, "I wanted to acknowledge what you've accomplished here. This renovation is impressive, and the community support you've generated is remarkable." Elena studied Margaret's face, searching for signs of sarcasm or hidden agenda, but finding only what appeared to be genuine, if reluctant, respect. "Thank you, Margaret. That means a lot coming from you. I also wanted to apologize for some of the things I said during the budget controversy. My concerns about fiscal responsibility were legitimate, but my comments about your appearance were inappropriate and cruel." Elena felt a flutter of surprise at the directness of the apology. "I appreciate you saying that. Jessica has helped me understand some things about my own assumptions and prejudices. It's been an educational experience." Margaret's smile was rueful but seemed sincere. She's been quite passionate about inclusion advocacy since Tyler's accident. She's become a real leader among the young people. Tyler, too, his art has helped a lot of people see disability from new perspectives. Margaret nodded, then seemed to steel herself for something more difficult. "I should also tell you that the development project Robert and I were pursuing has been canceled. The environmental issues proved too expensive to resolve, just as your friend David predicted." Elena felt relieved that the threat to the library's location had been permanently resolved, but also sympathetic to Margaret's financial disappointment. "I'm sorry that didn't work out for you. Actually, I think it's for the best. This library renovation has shown me that Cedar Falls needs community spaces more than it needs commercial development. Sometimes what's good for the town isn't what's most profitable for individuals." After Margaret left, Elena stood alone in the renovated library space, taking in the transformation that surrounded her. The physical changes were remarkable: better lighting, wider access, more welcoming spaces. But the deeper transformation was in herself and in the community's understanding of what it meant to truly welcome everyone. David returned from helping Jake Murphy load leftover supplies into his truck. "Ready to head home?" Elena took one last look around the library that had become so much more than her workplace. It was the place where she'd learned to stop hiding, where she'd discovered her own strength, where she'd helped build something beautiful and lasting. "Yes," she said, taking David's offered arm as they stepped out into the warm summer evening. "I'm ready." As they walked home together through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fire that had scarred her face had seemed like an ending 5 years ago, the end of her dreams, her confidence, her belief in her own worth. But it had actually been a beginning. Not the beginning she would have chosen, but one that had led to discoveries about courage, community, and the many forms that beauty could take. The scars would always be part of her story, but they were no longer the defining chapter. They were simply evidence of survival, proof of resilience, markers of a life fully lived despite difficulty. And in a world that often equated worth with perfection, perhaps that was the most beautiful truth of all. Elena Morrison had learned that she was beautiful exactly as she was, not despite her scars, but because of everything they represented. About her strength, her courage, and her refusal to let other people's limitations define her possibilities. And in learning that truth about herself, she had helped an entire community learn to see beauty in all its diverse and imperfect forms. Transformation was complete, but the story would continue. Because real beauty, the kind that means survival, courage, and turning pain into purpose, only grows stronger with time. 3 weeks after the library reopening, Elena received a phone call that would expand her influence far beyond Cedar Falls. Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Minnesota School of Library and Information Science had attended the reopening ceremony and been deeply impressed by what she'd witnessed. "Elena, I'm calling to invite you to speak at our annual conference on inclusive library services," Dr. Williams explained. "Your approach to community engagement and accessibility has created a model that other libraries desperately need to see." Elena felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the prospect of speaking to a large professional audience, but it was overshadowed by excitement about sharing what Cedar Falls had accomplished. "I'd be honored, but I should mention that this wasn't just my work. The whole community made these changes possible. That's exactly why your story is so powerful. Too often, accessibility improvements are imposed from above rather than growing from genuine community engagement. Your approach demonstrates how inclusion becomes sustainable when it emerges from relationship building and mutual understanding." Conference was scheduled for October, giving Elena 2 months to prepare a presentation that would capture not just the practical aspects of the library renovation, but the deeper transformation that had made it possible. She found herself energized by the challenge of distilling their experience into lessons that other communities could adapt to their own circumstances. David helped her practice the presentation in the library's new community room, offering feedback on everything from slide design to speaking pace. "Remember," he said after one particularly polished run-through, "you're not just talking about library science. You're talking about how communities learn to see each other's humanity." Elena nodded, understanding that her story had implications far beyond library administration. The transformation of Cedar Falls offered hope for other places struggling with division, prejudice, and the challenge of creating genuine belonging for all residents. The week before the conference, Elena received another unexpected opportunity. Jessica Thornton burst into the library with the breathless excitement of someone carrying momentous news. "Elena, you'll never believe this. I just got off the phone with a documentary filmmaker from Minneapolis. She wants to make a film about what's happened here in Cedar Falls." Elena felt her stomach drop slightly. "A documentary? What exactly?" "About how one person's courage to stand up for herself can transform an entire community. About how real inclusion works from the ground up. About how beauty really does mean survival." The filmmaker, Maria Santos, had heard about Cedar Falls through the Disability Advocacy Network and was developing a project about communities that had successfully implemented inclusive practices. She wanted to spend a week in town interviewing residents and documenting the various programs and initiatives that had grown out of Elena's initial struggle for acceptance. Elena agreed to participate, though not without some nervousness about having her story broadcast to a wider audience. The filming process proved less intrusive than she'd feared, with Maria focusing more on the community's collective journey than on Elena's personal trauma. The interviews revealed perspectives Elena hadn't fully appreciated. Jake Murphy spoke movingly about how the library's accessibility Improvements had given his son Daniel new independence and confidence. Anna Chun described how the cultural exchange programs had helped her feel truly welcomed in America for the first time in 40 years. Dr. Chun talked about the ripple effects she'd observed in her medical practice, with patients more willing to discuss disabilities and differences they'd previously hidden. Most surprisingly, several people mentioned how Elena's example had encouraged them to be more open about their own struggles. Pastor Williams revealed that he'd been hiding his increasing vision loss, afraid that admitting his limitations would force him into retirement. Watching Elena embrace her scars had given him courage to seek the assistive technology he needed to continue his ministry. The bakery owner, Jim Peterson, shared that his daughter had been bullied at school for her learning disability until Elena's story inspired the family to advocate more openly for accommodations. Elena showed us that hiding differences doesn't protect anyone, he said. It just makes people feel more alone. During the filming, Elena also learned about changes she hadn't directly witnessed. The high school had implemented new anti-bullying policies, specifically addressing appearance-based harassment. The Methodist Church had started an accessibility committee to ensure their building could welcome parishioners with various disabilities. Even the annual Harvest Festival had been redesigned to include sensory-friendly activities and wheelchair-accessible vendor booths. The documentary would take months to complete, but Maria shared some preliminary footage with the community before leaving. Watching herself and her neighbors on screen, Elena was struck by how natural and unremarkable their inclusive practices had become. What had once required conscious effort now felt like the obvious way to treat each other. The university conference in October proved to be a turning point in Elena's professional development. Her presentation, titled "Beautiful Means Survived: Building Inclusive Libraries Through Community Relationships," drew the largest audience of the three-day event. Elena spoke not just about accessibility modifications, but about the cultural shifts that made such changes sustainable. Technical compliance with disability laws is just the beginning, Elena told the assembled librarians and administrators. Real accessibility happens when every person who enters your library feels genuinely welcomed, valued, and supported. That requires ongoing relationship building, not just one-time renovations. During the question and answer session, a librarian from Duluth asked about resistance from community members who opposed inclusive changes. Elena shared her experience with Margaret Thornton, emphasizing how listening to concerns and finding common ground had eventually transformed an opponent into a neutral observer, if not an active supporter. Change is scary for everyone, Elena explained. People who resist inclusion often fear that expanding welcome to others somehow diminishes their own place in the community. Our job is to demonstrate that true belonging isn't a zero-sum game. Creating space for more people actually enriches the experience for everyone. After the conference, Elena received invitations to consult with libraries in 3 other Minnesota communities planning their own accessibility improvements. The work would supplement her income while allowing her to spread the lessons learned in Cedar Falls to places where they could benefit other isolated individuals. Back home, autumn brought new developments that continued to surprise Elena with their scope and creativity. The success of the Korean language classes had inspired requests for Spanish conversation groups, led by Maria Rodriguez, and basic English literacy sessions for adult immigrants. The library's community room hosted support group meetings for veterans, caregivers, and people dealing with chronic illnesses. Tyler's art therapy workshops had become so popular that the library partnered with the county hospital to offer them as part of their rehabilitation services. Patients recovering from strokes, accidents, and surgeries traveled from surrounding towns to participate in sessions that used creative expression to process trauma and build resilience. Elena found herself serving on the county's new commission on disability rights, a role that felt both natural and slightly surreal. 2 years ago, she'd been hiding from public attention. Now she was helping shape policy that would affect thousands of people throughout the region. The Commission's work focused on education, advocacy, and resource development. Elena contributed insights about how small modifications could dramatically improve accessibility, while learning from other commissioners about employment discrimination, housing challenges, and transportation barriers faced by people with various disabilities. One particularly meaningful project involved developing a resource guide for families dealing with acquired disabilities, people who, like Elena and David, had experienced life-changing injuries or illnesses. The guide combined practical information about services and support with personal stories of adaptation and resilience. Elena contributed a chapter about navigating social reactions to visible differences, drawing from her journey from isolation to advocacy. Writing about her experience in clinical detail was challenging but ultimately liberating, transforming her personal struggle into a resource that might help others facing similar challenges. David's own transformation continued to unfold in unexpected directions. His success with Jake Murphy had led to opportunities with other contractors throughout the region, and he'd developed a reputation for creative problem-solving that accommodated various physical limitations. His military engineering background, combined with his personal understanding of disability, made him uniquely qualified to design accessible solutions that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. More significantly, David had begun volunteering with a veterans organization that helped recently injured service members transition to civilian life. His combination of technical skills and lived experience made him an effective mentor for younger veterans struggling with amputation, brain injury, and PTSD. "It's strange," David reflected during one of their evening walks through downtown Cedar Falls. "I spent 2 years after my injury thinking my military service was over, that I had nothing left to contribute. Now I'm using my experience to help other people find their way forward." Elena understood completely. Her own journey from victim to advocate had taught her that survival could become a form of service, that overcoming personal challenges often equipped people to help others facing similar struggles. The 1-year anniversary of the budget meeting brought an unexpected celebration. Mrs. Patterson announced that the library had been selected to receive a statewide award for innovative community programming, with specific recognition for their accessibility initiatives and cultural exchange programs. The award ceremony would take place in Minneapolis, with Elena invited to accept the honor on behalf of the Cedar Falls community. Standing on the stage of the state capitol's auditorium, Elena looked out at an audience of legislators, educators, and community leaders from across Minnesota. "This award belongs not to me, but to a community that chose courage over comfort," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the large space. Cedar Falls learned that true strength comes from ensuring that every person can participate fully in community life. "We discovered that accommodating differences doesn't weaken our shared identity, it reveals the values that actually hold us together." Elena concluded her acceptance speech with words that had become her signature message. "Beautiful doesn't mean perfect. Beautiful means survived. Beautiful means to keep fighting. Beautiful means turned pain into purpose. And beautiful means recognize that our differences are not obstacles to overcome, but gifts to celebrate." The standing ovation that followed felt like validation, not just for Elena's personal journey, but for the possibility that communities could indeed transform themselves through intentional acts of inclusion and welcome. After the ceremony, Elena was approached by representatives from several organizations interested in replicating Cedar Falls' approach. A foundation focused on rural community development wanted to fund similar projects in other small towns. A university research center proposed studying their model to develop best practices for community-based accessibility initiatives. Most intriguingly, a national disability rights organization invited Elena to join their speakers bureau, sharing her story at conferences and workshops across the country. The opportunity would allow her to influence inclusion efforts far beyond Minnesota while continuing her work in Cedar Falls. Elena accepted the invitation with excitement tempered by awareness of the responsibility it represented. Her personal story had become something larger, a symbol of how individual courage could catalyze community transformation, how acceptance of difference could strengthen rather than threaten social bonds. As winter approached and Elena prepared for her expanded role as an advocate and consultant, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from isolation to influence. The scars that had once made her feel marked for rejection had become the foundation for a career dedicated to ensuring that no one had to face exclusion alone. The fire that had changed her face 5 years ago had indeed changed her life, but not in the devastating way she'd initially feared. Instead, it had led her to discover strengths she never knew she possessed, relationships deeper than she'd thought possible, and a purpose that gave meaning to every challenge she'd overcome. Cedar Falls had become more than Elena's home. It was proof that communities could learn, grow, and transform themselves when individuals had the courage to demand belonging exactly as they were. And as Elena looked toward a future filled with opportunities to share that message with others, she knew that the most important part of her story was still being written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.